James reluctantly attended his wife Emily's annual office gathering at an upscale rooftop venue in downtown Chicago. The sparkling city skyline served as a breathtaking backdrop as well-dressed professionals in suits and cocktail dresses mingled, exchanging laughter and toasts. James, a hard-working small business owner, felt out of place in this corporate environment that seemed so natural to Emily. She had been unusually excited about this year's event, spending extra time perfecting her appearance and brushing off his inquiries about the guest list. As he leaned against the bar, feeling like an afterthought, he couldn't help but notice how effortlessly Emily moved through the crowd, charming her colleagues while barely acknowledging his presence. A subtle but undeniable sense of distance between them began to churn in his gut, something he had never felt before. Reflecting on the evening, James recalls with bitterness, "That night, I learned just how much of a stranger my wife had become to me." What started as an evening of forced small talk would soon spiral into an unforgettable confrontation, changing his life forever. He shivers as he remembers. "I thought I was just going to a party, but I had no idea I was walking into the most humiliating and dangerous night of my life." As James stood uncomfortably by the bar, nursing his drink and observing the crowd, a nagging sense of unease settled in. Emily was laughing and chatting effortlessly with her coworkers, completely ignoring him. Her previous excitement about the party now seemed misplaced, as though her focus had shifted from enjoying the night with him to maintaining her image. Then he began to notice unsettling details, whispers from groups of coworkers, followed by furtive glances in his direction. It wasn't just paranoia. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and he could feel it creeping up on him. As he debated whether to leave or confront Emily about her behavior, she suddenly approached him. However, she was not alone. Standing beside her was Jake, a coworker James had never met but immediately disliked. Jake's overconfident posture and the way he hovered too close to Emily sent red flags through James's mind. The casual touch of Jake's hand on Emily's back only intensified his discomfort. Jake eyed James with a smug grin and addressed him directly. "So you're her husband?" His voice carried a challenging tone, as if daring James to object. "I'm going to dance with her now," Jake added, his smirk deepening. Instead of defending her husband, Emily made James's frustration boil over. She scoffed and said dismissively, "You don't need his permission." Her tone was light, almost playful, as she urged Jake, "Come on!" The sheer disrespect in Jake's voice and Emily's casual dismissal of James left him momentarily speechless. His heart pounded as a surge of anger built within him. He had expected Emily to react differently, to challenge Jake, to laugh off the audacity of his comment, or at the very least, glance his way for reassurance. But instead, she shocked him by siding with Jake. Her voice was so dismissive, so nonchalant, as she reiterated, "You don't need his permission," as if nothing was wrong. The words stung more deeply than any insult. It wasn't just a betrayal of her words. It was how easily she dismissed his feelings in front of her coworker. The emotional cut was sharper than James could have ever anticipated. In that moment, he realized the woman he thought he knew had become someone completely different. James assumed Jake, emboldened by Emily's indifference, would back off. But instead, he leaned in even closer, his grin growing darker and more threatening. His eyes flickered toward James, and in a mocking tone, he sneered, "You don't own her, buddy. I'm going to dance with her, and maybe even more." The words dripped with arrogance, and the challenge in his voice made James's blood run cold. A wave of pure rage surged through him as he clenched his fists, fighting the urge to act on his instincts. Jake's hand casually rested on Emily's arm, guiding her toward the dance floor. It wasn't a spontaneous act of cockiness. It was intentional. As they walked away, James's thoughts raced, his sense of humiliation growing with each step they took. He realized that whatever bond he thought he had with Emily had been shattered in that moment. The tension was building, leading to a confrontation he knew was inevitable. From the edge of the dance floor, James could barely contain his boiling fury as he watched Jake and Emily move together. Their dance was too suggestive, far too intimate for a workplace event or any occasion where a husband should be present. Jake's hands lingered too long on Emily's waist, pulling her closer, and she did nothing to push him away. The betrayal stabbed James like a knife, but he struggled to keep his composure, reminding himself of the potential fallout of making a scene. However, every part of him screamed to take action. Then, Jake crossed a line that silenced even the background noise of the party faded as Jake, with a smug grin aimed directly at James, slid his hands under Emily's blouse. His fingers traced along her back as though James were not standing there watching. Gasps rippled through the crowd, their stunned expressions confirming that this moment was just as outrageous as it seemed. James's restraint snapped. The humiliation and fury were too much to endure. He stormed across the room, his voice trembling with rage as he shouted for Jake to back off. The crowd parted as he approached, all eyes locking onto him. Jake, however, did not back down. Instead, he leaned closer to Emily, as if daring James to do something. "What are you even going to do about it?" Jake taunted, his voice dripping with arrogance. James's hand shook, not with fear, but with pure raw rage. Unable to hold back any more, he revealed the coat concealed beneath his jacket, pulling it out just enough for Jake and those nearby to see. The room fell into stunned silence. The music and laughter came to an abrupt halt as everyone's attention shifted to James. His voice, now cold and deliberate, cut through the stillness as he warned Jake. "Step away from my wife." The tension in the room was suffocating, a moment teetering on the brink of chaos. James's glare was unwavering as he demanded again, "Step away from her. Now!" The weight of his command was felt by everyone present. For a split second, even Jake seemed to consider backing off. But emboldened by the crowd's attention and perhaps the alcohol fueling his bravado, he smirked and taunted. "What's the matter, James? Afraid she might enjoy this more than she ever enjoyed you?" His arrogance reached its peak, and James's blood boiled. Emily, caught in the middle, seemed frozen, her expression unreadable. The crowd, no longer whispering, watched in tense silence, eyes darting between the two men, waiting to see what would happen next. Jake leaned in even closer to Emily, as if daring James to make a move. The smugness on his face was unbearable. Without thinking, James stepped forward and threw a punch, landing squarely on Jake's jaw. Jake staggered backward, crashing into a nearby table. The crowd gasped, some recoiling in shock while others rushed to intervene. Jake, clutching his face, glared up at James. His earlier bravado had been replaced by a mix of anger and humiliation. The coat, still visible but unused, served as a quiet reminder of how far James could have taken things, but chose not to. James had struck with such precision that it shattered Jake's arrogance, exposing his true nature in front of the very crowd he had been desperate to impress. The impact of the punch was immediate. Security rushed in to take control of the escalating situation. A dazed Jake was dragged away, his pride broken, while whispers of disbelief rippled through the room. James stood frozen, his fists still clenched, trying to process what had just unfolded. Though the physical confrontation had ended, the emotional aftermath was only beginning. He knew the night was far from over. The unraveling had only just begun. As the tension in the room began to fade, it was clear the chaos of the altercation had left an indelible mark. Security quickly moved to de-escalate things, but the damage had already been done. Jake, still reeling from the punch, held his bruised jaw as he was escorted out. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by visible shame. The cocky grin that had taunted James throughout the evening was gone, replaced by a scowl of defeat. The crowd's judgmental stares and hushed whispers followed him as he exited the venue, his departure marking the end of his arrogance. James stood watching him leave, knowing he had made his point in the most public way possible. But while Jake's exit might have seemed like closure, it only opened the door to a new confrontation. Emily, who had remained silent during the altercation, suddenly erupted. Her voice was sharp, filled with anger and desperation as she turned on James, tears in her eyes. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she yelled. "You've ruined everything." Instead of acknowledging Jake's inappropriate actions or her own involvement, she shifted all the blame onto James. Her attempt to paint herself as the victim only deepened the sense of betrayal James was already feeling. She berated him in front of her colleagues, accusing him of overreacting and embarrassing her. The room's attention shifted from Jake's public humiliation to the very real breakdown of James and Emily's marriage, unfolding before everyone. The pitying glances and judgmental stares from the guests only added to James's emotional turmoil. His fists remained clenched as he stood there, realizing that this wasn't just about Jake. It was about something far deeper. It was about them. And in that moment, James understood his marriage had just reached the point of no return. The deeper issues in their relationship had now been exposed for all to see. The events of that night marked the beginning of the end for James and Emily's marriage. In the days that followed, the full truth of their situation came to light. Jake's arrogant behavior had not been a momentary lapse in judgment. It had been part of a long-running affair between him and Emily. As James put the pieces together, he realized that Emily's unusual excitement about the party, the suspicious glances, and the whispered conversations had all been signs. Nearly everyone at her workplace had known about the affair. The humiliation he had felt that night only deepened as he uncovered the extent of her betrayal. But instead of letting it consume him, it ignited a determination within him to take control of his life again. Emily's actions did not just destroy their marriage, they also ruined her reputation at work. Word of the scandal spread quickly through the office, and as more details about her affair with Jake emerged, she became a pariah among her colleagues. The coworkers who had once admired her now distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone who had caused such a public disgrace. Jake, too, faced the fallout of his reckless behavior. His inappropriate actions at the party were reported to HR, and within weeks he was fired for misconduct. The affair's downfall was just as public as the confrontation that had exposed it, leaving both Emily and Jake to face the consequences of their actions. For James, the resolution was swift and clear. Refusing to let Emily manipulate him into staying, he filed for divorce immediately. He was no longer willing to tolerate the pain and betrayal that had shattered his life. As he looked back on the situation, he found an unexpected sense of empowerment in taking control of his future. He was reclaiming his dignity. The legal battle that followed was grueling, but there was satisfaction in knowing that his actions were guided by integrity, while Emily's choices led to her own undoing. Looking back on that pivotal night, James saw how it reshaped his life. It had been a turning point, one that taught him the most valuable lesson of all, the importance of self-respect. The betrayal had stung deeply, but it had also opened his eyes to the reality of his marriage. Staying in a relationship where he was disrespected and taken for granted would have only diminished his sense of worth. Walking away had been painful, but it was the only way to prioritize his own value and dignity. James reflected on the strength it took to confront the toxic dynamics of his marriage and remove himself from an environment that was destroying his happiness. "Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that save you," he said, his voice filled with conviction. He stressed that no one should ever feel obligated to stay in a relationship where they are mistreated, whether with a partner, a friend, or anyone else. Letting go of toxic people isn't just about ending a relationship. It's about creating space for healthier opportunities and a better future. As he shared his final thoughts, James expressed gratitude for the clarity that night had brought him. Though it had been a painful chapter, it had ultimately made him stronger and more confident. He reminded his audience that self-respect is not something to wait for others to give. It is something you must take for yourself. Sometimes the most empowering thing you can do is walk away from what's breaking you, to make room for what can rebuild you. James ended with a powerful reflection, encapsulating the wisdom he had gained from this painful journey. "That night taught me a crucial lesson," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You can't control someone's loyalty, but you can control how much of yourself you are willing to lose for them." This realization was pivotal. He could not dictate Emily's actions or force her to be loyal, but he could control how much of his identity and integrity he was willing to sacrifice for a relationship that was no longer worth saving. Through betrayal, he learned that the most important thing was not holding on to someone who did not value him, but protecting his own sense of self. As he moved forward, this lesson stayed with him, reminding him that while love and loyalty are vital, they should never come at the cost of self-respect and well-being. In his closing thoughts, James offered a universal truth that resonated far beyond his own experience. Knowing your worth, setting boundaries, and never allowing yourself to be diminished by others are essential for a healthy life. Sometimes, walking away is the only way to regain your power and stay loyal to yourself. Thank you for being a part of this story. If it resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. Many of you who enjoy these stories are not subscribed yet, and by subscribing, you are joining a community that values deep, meaningful storytelling. Let's continue exploring these heartfelt journeys together. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a new story.